Hi.
Hi, good
To
afternoon.
to start ourselves off, can you introduce yourself, what you teach, and any other information you think would be important to your job as an educator?
Certainly. Thank you. My name is Sharon Whittier, and I am a special education teacher for K through 2 students in Massachusetts. I am in my 8th year of teaching. Before that, I was a paraprofessional for many, many years working in preschool. And between preschool and getting my current position, I also taught an autism spectrum disorder program for about 5 years.
All right, thank you. You've definitely got all the credentials to answer these questions.
I hope
So,
so.
trust me, they're not too difficult. First off, how do you work the backgrounds of your students into lesson planning?
The first thing that I do is you really have to get to know your students. You have to get to know them personally. It's good to get to know their families and find out because not every there are no families that are the same. I come from a very small school, as you know, in Ashby, Massachusetts, so it's a very small school, but with in not a lot of diversity, but over the past year or two, we certainly have gained some diversity within our school, which is fabulous.
I've heard
So
about
the
that growth.
yeah, it's wonderful. So the first thing is really to get to know your students. You always, always, always want to pay special attention to any backgrounds, especially with different cultures, because you want to be sensitive to those different cultures. And then I always try to bring in those various cultures throughout my teaching. A lot of times through the holidays, I do a lot in lessons about traditions, and that's when I talk to families and find out what their traditions are. I usually send out a little note and asking parents about their traditions. And I've asked parents to come in and talk about different traditions. And then there's always those types of traditions, but then I always try to learn about my students' learning style because then again, every student has a different learning style. And parents are their first teachers and really their best teachers. Parents are going to know what children really need. Parents might say, well, I really don't know. They're only 4, but they will tell you, do they need more transition time? Do they take to things really quickly? Those types of things. So it's really about making those connections with your students and their families. It's equally important in my idea to make the connection with the families as well because they are such an important. I teach early childhood, so for me, those little kids, you really need to make those connections and use whatever information you can gather to help those students, both
That
academically and socially.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think you actually partially answered the next question with your talk about incorporating all of the holidays. But what techniques do you use to connect the class subject to real life contexts, either
Oh,
holidays or seasons or what's going on in the world?
I pretty much every day I start off every single one of my classes and I pull small groups. So I have various groups throughout my day. Every single class starts off with, I'm going to ask you a question. We're going to take what I call a thinking minute, give everybody a minute to kind of gather their thoughts, and then we answer it. And I always try to do different things. What did you do over the weekend? What is a tradition you may have? What did you eat last night for supper? What games do you like to play? So you just kind of bring that in, and then vocabulary is so important. When I'm reading a book, even at this young age, I read the book first. Even in very young children's books, there are a lot of words. I don't know if a child knows what recover means or, whatever. So that's another really basic but important part to make sure that your children are understanding your vocabulary, either that you're speaking or that you're reading. And again, traditions, especially around the holidays, and a lot of times it's amazing to me children make connections through everything. I mean, I could be reading a little Clifford book and they could be telling me about the dog that they just had, or, so it's listening to those connections and then picking up on it. So you make a little note, oh, so and so has an Alaskan husky, or, whatever it is. So, you're always, trying to bring those bring everything back, think about what the child is saying. So everything. I always try to listen. I think listening is a really important part of teaching, because if you're not listening, you're not taking in that information.
Yeah, I bet the kids adore the thinking moment, and so do I. I bet
Yeah.
the opportunity to share is
Yes.
just exciting for them.
Yeah. And a lot of times, especially, my second graders are like, "Oh, I don't know what I have for supper." I'm like, "Yeah, let's take another thinking minute, because, sometimes you have to pry, pull it out of
Yeah.
them. But I always say we're going to take a thinking minute, because that gives everybody an opportunity to just think about it. I don't want to put people right on the spot right away. And I always model. So I always model. We always echo back the question. So if I asked what was for dinner last night, I would say, I'm going to echo back the question. Last night for dinner, I had pizza. So that way they're gaining that language piece as well, knowing how to answer a question by echoing it back.
Yeah, that makes sense. So speaking of having to sometimes pull answers from students, how do you establish and maintain classroom standards? Things like behavior, participation, goals.
We do a lot of like classroom norms. So, a lot of times we'll set up classroom rules or classroom norms. A lot of the curriculum that we're using now has target goals, and norms for everything that we do. So I use that a lot. Behavior can be difficult because depending on where the child is or what they've been diagnosed with or not diagnosed with, there's a plethora of things that it could be. So that I'm lucky because I have the background knowledge of being in a behavior program. So I have the knowledge of being able to do the first thens and the charts where, for, every time you're doing something correct, you give them a little star, and after 10 stars, they get, 2 minutes of, their own time. And then of course you try to, scale that back. Behavior charts, things like that. So, um, you know, the beginning of the year is crazy. It isn't about until mid October that you're really starting to get a sense. You're going to have great days, and then you're going to have days where you go home and you go, oh my God, what am I
Yeah.
doing?
So you're
Um,
still in the crazy time now.
Still in the crazy time, but you know what? It gets better every single day. Hopefully. I mean, that's the goal, is that, every single day. And again, we talked earlier about baby steps, or just seeing that little bit of progression. So currently I have a student who is new to the district and came from Medford, and she has a variety of her IEP is quite big, but she has ADHD, she has ASD, and she has a visual impairment. Sweet girl, I love her to death already. And but one of her biggest things is she can physically sit in her chair, but she won't. She wanders the classroom. So that is my chore this weekend, to try to figure out how to get her to sit in that chair.
Interesting.
Yeah. And she's in a classroom of 28 students. So with no para, as I talked about earlier, our biggest struggle is not having people. So it's hard for a gen ed teacher of 28 to be dealing with, 27 students with no other adult support. And then, a student who literally wanders around the classroom all day long. So we're working on it. I guarantee she'll be sitting in that chair by the end of the year.
Yeah. So you mentioned working with students, different IEPs. You've talked about students coming from different classrooms, and also the fact that, this is a class of 28 students with, a whole variety of needs. What kind of mindset activities do you think are necessary to create an inclusive classroom?
Um, I think that first of all, you have to have a teacher who embraces that role. Um, because not all teachers do. And I don't want to categorize or generalize, but I think I'm going to say older teachers, but I mean teachers that have been teaching for a long time versus age. Things have changed over the past 20 years, 30 years, even, when you were in school, I think generally our society has changed. So therefore our children have changed. Um, so I think that hopefully parents are helping by, eh, you know, um, teaching their children about different types of people and different types of children and culture and disabilities and all that. So you're hoping that your children come in with some type of a already having some background knowledge. And then as a classroom teacher, you have to make sure that you're reading books again about different cultures and different disabilities and things like that. So exposing your children to various things. And then you have to make sure you're including all of your activities have to be accessible to every student. So should you have a student like the student that I have that has visual impairment. You wouldn't put her in the back of the room and be showing, be expecting her to be looking at something up on the board, which is, 40 feet away. So constantly being aware of each child's needs. And then the biggest thing is to make sure that all of your children are being respectful to each other. That's the biggest thing because and that goes is I think that especially young children, they follow in adults footsteps. So I think if as the teacher, if you're modeling good behavior, then hopefully your children will kind of follow through. So you just want to make sure that every student feels loved. There should be, there's no matter what it is, or whatever, you want to be one family unit, one unit, because that's what, in my opinion, when I have my students for a year, they're my family for that year. So I need to take care of each and every single one of them to make sure that they're all growing.
That is absolutely wonderful.